In the dim glow of a flickering projector, shadows twist across the walls, and the faint scent of celluloid mingles with fear. These aren't just films, they are American nightmares, each one a mirror reflecting the darkest corners of the human mind. From the blood-soaked streets of imagined towns to the haunted corridors of suburban homes, 15 horror classics were crafted not just to scare, but to unsettle, disturb, and linger. Some filmmakers claimed inspiration from true crimes, others from personal obsession, yet each left audiences trembling, questioning reality, and peering over their shoulders long after the credits rolled. Long before horror became a genre defined by cheap scares and jump cuts, early American filmmakers discovered that the most effective terror was the kind that whispered to the mind rather than shouted at the senses. They understood that fear thrives when reality and fiction overlap, when the audience feels that what they are watching could, in some sinister way, be true. In the 1920s and 1930s, as motion pictures evolved from novelty into cultural force, filmmakers experimented with shadow, silence, and suggestion. The flickering image of a stranger in a fogged street, a child staring from a cracked doorway, or a hand appearing unexpectedly in the darkness could unsettle viewers more profoundly than any overt act of violence. These films operated like mirrors, reflecting societal anxieties that most people refuse to articulate aloud. It was during these decades that some of the first, truly disturbing films emerged, often inspired by contemporary crimes. One notorious example depicted a faceless intruder who methodically terrorized a family in their own home. A plot eerily reminiscent of a series of unsolved break-ins and assaults reported in several Midwestern towns. Townspeople who attended screenings later reported a chilling sense of recognition, the uncanny feeling that the scenes could have happened in their own neighborhoods. The filmmakers, some of whom were avid readers of local newspapers, did not shy away from incorporating details lifted directly from the reports: an overturned chair, a shattered window, a trail of muddy footprints blurring the line between cinematic imagination and lived reality. These early films also relied heavily on atmosphere to instill unease. Directors placed characters in ordinary settings: a rural farmhouse, a bustling urban street, a shadowed alley, and then introduced subtle distortions: a clock that ticked too loudly, a door that opened on its own, a fleeting silhouette in the background. Audiences reacted with unease because these distortions felt plausible, possible, almost inevitable. The terror was not distant or fantastical. It was domestic, immediate, and intimate. One film showed a young woman walking home under a street lamp, only for the shadows to elongate unnaturally behind her. Viewers later recalled leaving the theater and scanning darkened streets with the same apprehension, as if expecting the malevolent shapes to continue beyond the frame. Actors and crew often contributed to the unsettling effect. Some performers claimed to have felt genuine fear on set, reacting instinctively to unexplained movements or noises in the empty theater where they rehearsed. Crew members whispered of strange coincidences during filming: props falling without cause, the sound of footsteps echoing in halls long after shooting ended, and cold drafts that seemed to follow certain actors. These accounts, whether embellished or truthful, fed a growing mythology around these films and lent them an aura of authenticity. To the audience, the line between fiction and fact began to dissolve, reinforcing the impression that what they saw on screen could, in some dark sense, be real. Even the marketing of these films capitalized on this delicate interplay between reality and fiction. Posters warned viewers of the terrifying true-to-life scenarios contained within, and press releases often hinted at shocking incidents that had inspired the story. Some films included disclaimers claiming to be based on actual events, though the details were often exaggerated or fabricated. Yet the claim alone was enough to unsettle audiences, inviting them to peer closer at the shadows and listen more carefully to the silence, always wondering whether the next horrifying moment might step off the screen and into their own lives. As these films gained popularity, a subtle, almost invisible tension emerged between creator and audience, a shared complicity in the exploration of fear. Viewers came to the theater not merely for entertainment, but for the thrill of encountering something they could almost believe in, something that suggested the presence of danger just beyond the periphery of daily life. The earliest American horror films, in their deliberate blurring of fiction and reality, laid the foundation for decades of cinematic terror to come, establishing a pattern that would resonate in countless later classics, each one testing the limits of how closely a story could mimic truth and how deeply fear could be imprinted on the mind. Some filmmakers were not merely storytellers, they were chroniclers of obsession, their own fixations bleeding into every frame, every shadow, every whispered line of dialogue. In the 1950s and 1960s, a handful of directors in America became notorious for the intensity of their personal involvement, allowing their fears, traumas, and macabre fascinations to shape the worlds they depicted on screen. One director, whose childhood had been haunted by tales of local murders and unexplained disappearances, insisted on using real locations connected to those crimes, believing the walls themselves carried residual energy. Actors reported feeling a palpable tension in these spaces, an oppressive weight that seemed to press against the lens of the camera, heightening the atmosphere of dread. The obsession extended beyond location. Some directors meticulously studied human behavior, devoting hours to observing gestures, mannerisms, and expressions that might convey subtle unease. A hand trembling at the wrong moment, a glance that lingered too long, a faint sigh in the darkness, each became a deliberate tool for psychological manipulation. The results were unnerving because they tapped into the audience's unconscious recognition of discomfort. Viewers could not explain why a scene unsettled them so completely, only that the tension felt authentic, as though the characters' fears were a reflection of their own deepest anxieties. These filmmakers also often blurred the line between life and performance, encouraging actors to internalize the terror their characters experienced. One actress recalled being told to wander an abandoned house alone at night, allowing the director to capture her genuine fear on film. The crew claimed that shadows seemed to move independently, and faint whispers were occasionally audible through the empty halls, though no one could locate the source. Rumors circulated for years that the director had consulted local psychics and occult practitioners for advice on how to evoke authentic terror, practices that further cemented the aura of menace surrounding the production. The obsessions were not purely psychological. They were frequently macabre in a literal sense. Some directors maintained archives of disturbing photographs, crime scene documentation, and newspaper clippings, drawing directly from them when crafting key sequences. One infamous scene depicted a victim bound in a manner that mirrored a notorious unsolved local murder. Critics accused the filmmaker of exploitation, yet audiences were drawn by the unnerving realism, compelled to confront the thin barrier between cinematic fiction and the horrors of the real world. Crew members often whispered that certain props were charged with a residual darkness, as if handling them carried a risk of drawing the actors into the obsessive energy that had inspired them. Even sound design was manipulated with obsessive precision. Directors demanded recordings of distant screams, footsteps, and whispers layered in ways imperceptible to the conscious ear, but triggering subconscious unease. Some would play these sounds repeatedly during shooting, insisting that actors internalize them, their reactions becoming a subtle but genuine echo of fear. One camera operator recalled a scene in which every shadow seemed to twist unnaturally, every reflection momentarily displaced from reality, as though the very environment had been altered to mirror the director's inner turmoil. The impact of these obsessions extended beyond the set. Films produced under the influence of such singular fixation often inspired rumors and legends. Stories spread of actors experiencing strange accidents, disappearances, or bouts of unexplained illness, as if the darkness captured on film had escaped into the real world. Certain audiences reported intense, lingering reactions, with nightmares and paranoia persisting long after viewing. The films became both art and psychological experiment, demonstrating the terrifying extent to which a creator's personal obsession could shape not only the story, but the very minds of those who engaged with it. In the hands of these directors, horror became more than spectacle. It became a mirror of human fixation and a testament to the obsessive drive to confront and sometimes summon the darkest facets of existence. Every shadow cast, every scream captured, every flickering image carried a fragment of the filmmaker's own fears, making the experience intensely intimate and disturbingly convincing, as though the audience were witnessing not a story, but a confession carved into celluloid. The influence of real crimes on America's darkest films cannot be overstated. Long before the age of sensationalized media and viral headlines, filmmakers drew directly from reports of murder, abduction, and unsolved disappearances, using these events as a blueprint for their most unsettling scenes. One notorious 1960s feature, now considered a landmark of psychological horror, mirrored a string of murders that had gripped the Midwest just years prior. Local newspapers described a shadowy figure who stalked women walking home alone, his methods methodical, almost ritualistic. The film recreated the details with eerie precision: the same alleyways, the same timing, the same ritualistic arrangements left behind. Audiences who knew the news stories felt a cold, undeniable recognition, a creeping realization that the nightmare on screen might have been taken from their very streets. Filmmakers often went to extraordinary lengths to ensure authenticity. Locations were carefully chosen not only for their cinematic value but also for their real-world history of violence or tragedy. One director famously scouted an abandoned farmhouse where a gruesome double homicide had occurred decades earlier, insisting the walls themselves held a resonance that could not be replicated on a soundstage. Crew members later spoke of unexplained occurrences: doors swinging open, shadowed figures glimpsed from the corner of the eye, and sudden drops in temperature during filming. While skeptics dismissed these reports, the pervasive atmosphere of unease lent the films a weight of reality that ordinary horror could never achieve. The stories themselves were often built around specific cases, borrowing methods, victims, and even crime scenes. In one example, a film depicting a family terrorized by an intruder lifted a sequence almost verbatim from a police report detailing a botched home invasion. The meticulous reproduction of events, the sounds, the timing, the sequence of terror created a chilling intimacy with real violence. Audiences were unnerved not only by the imagery, but by the knowledge that similar horrors had already occurred in real life. The boundary between imagination and reality blurred, leaving spectators to question the safety of their own neighborhoods, their own homes. Some filmmakers went further, drawing inspiration from unsolved mysteries that seemed to defy explanation. A series of disappearances in a small New England town during the 1950s, never solved and shrouded in rumor, inspired an entire sequence in a now classic horror film. The director traveled to the town, interviewed local residents, and scoured archives for details that could be incorporated into the script. The resulting scenes were infused with a sense of authenticity so profound that audience members familiar with the original events reported experiencing a visceral, almost premonitory unease, as if the film were documenting events that could still occur. The effect of weaving true crime into horror was twofold. It heightened the immediate fear and anchored the terror in a social and psychological reality. While fantastical monsters and supernatural threats could terrify, the knowledge that the violence depicted had echoes in the real world created a deeper, lingering dread. Viewers found themselves scanning their own streets, their own homes, looking for shadows that might mirror those on screen. Parents whispered warnings to children, Couples walked home more cautiously, and entire communities carried the residual tension into their daily lives. This integration of true crime into horror films also influenced the very structure of storytelling. Filmmakers studied criminal psychology, police reports, and court documents, using procedural details to craft suspense that felt procedural in its own right. The pacing of a murder, the placement of clues, the anticipation of discovery all mirrored real investigative techniques. Audiences were drawn into a sense of complicity, a shared knowledge that the events could have happened and might happen again. The terror was not abstract. It was methodical, intimate, and above all, disturbingly plausible. Over time, these films created a feedback loop. True crimes inspired horror. Horror intensified public fascination with true crime. And public obsession fueled further cinematic explorations of violence and fear. The boundaries between reality and fiction became a murky space in which audiences both delighted and recoiled, captivated by the knowledge that the horrors they witnessed on screen were not purely imagined, but reflections of humanity's most unsettling truths. By the late 1960s and into the 1970s, American horror began to evolve in ways that reflected not just isolated crimes, but the broader anxieties haunting the nation. Social unrest, the lingering trauma of war, political scandals, and cultural upheaval found their way into films, transforming the genre into a mirror for collective fear. Filmmakers began to explore the psyche of ordinary people under extraordinary duress, portraying violence, madness, and the breakdown of social norms not as distant threats, but as phenomena creeping into the fabric of daily life. The suburban home, once a symbol of comfort and security, became a stage for terror, a place where routine could twist into nightmare. One director, fascinated by the fragility of familial structures, created a film in which a seemingly idyllic family spiraled into chaos, driven by unseen forces and unresolved resentments. The home itself became a character, walls whispering secrets, rooms shifting subtly between reality and hallucination, a staircase that seemed to stretch further each night. Crew members later recounted that filming in the actual house, a century-old structure with a violent history, lent a palpable tension. Shadows seemed heavier, silence seemed denser, and objects occasionally moved without explanation. The psychological realism of the scenes made audiences uneasy, as they recognized the vulnerability inherent in their own domestic spaces. Horror during this period also began to grapple with generational trauma. Vietnam veterans returning to civilian life, families disrupted by political division, and communities fractured by social change were depicted through allegorical violence. One film, notorious for its brutal depiction of an isolated rural town, mirrored reports of real-life massacres and vigilante acts, blending the grotesque with the eerily familiar. Viewers reported feeling a creeping recognition of the events on screen, as if the director had tapped into hidden fears they carried silently. By capturing the anxieties of the era, these films transcended mere fright, becoming psychological documents of American unrest. Urban legends began to entwine with the films themselves, further blurring the line between fiction and reality. Stories circulated of actors experiencing unexplainable phenomena on set, sudden fainting, whispered voices, and shadowy figures appearing in camera lenses that no one had seen in person. In one case, an actor claimed that a prop knife, handled daily, seemed to hum with a cold energy, as though it remembered acts of violence committed long before filming. These accounts, whether true or exaggerated, added a layer of mythos to the productions, enhancing the perception that the horror was not confined to the screen, but could leak into the real world. The imagery in these films often drew from real-life tragedies, yet it was filtered through a psychological lens, creating a potent combination of verifiable fear and imaginative speculation. Viewers might recognize the architectural style of a home, the layout of a neighborhood, or even the silhouette of a particular tree, grounding the narrative in recognizable reality. At the same time, the filmmakers manipulated lighting, sound, and camera angles to twist those familiar spaces into distorted realms where safety was an illusion and normality was always on the verge of collapse. Sound design, too, became an instrument of terror. Subtle, almost imperceptible noises creaking floorboards, the whisper of wind through broken windows, distant laughter were layered to provoke tension at a subconscious level. Directors deliberately played with silence, allowing the absence of sound to create anticipation, forcing audiences to imagine the worst. The human mind, primed by cultural anxieties and personal fears, filled in the gaps with visions far more disturbing than any explicit image. The films of this era demonstrated that horror could serve as both entertainment and social commentary. They captured the psychological tremors running through communities, transforming collective unease into a cinematic experience that was as educational as it was terrifying. Audiences were compelled to confront the darkness lurking not only in the plots on screen, but within the social realities surrounding them, where violence, fear, and instability were never far away. Controversy has long been an inseparable companion of American horror, particularly when films dared to depict acts too grotesque or taboo for mainstream comfort. In the 1970s and 1980s, a wave of productions pushed boundaries, deliberately showcasing violence, depravity, and psychological torment that provoked public outrage. Some scenes incited near riots in theaters, while others drew the attention of censors who demanded cuts or banned screenings entirely. One particularly infamous film, which portrayed a series of ritualistic murders in a small, isolated town, became the subject of national debate. Audiences were shocked not merely by the blood and gore, but by the meticulous attention to detail, the killer's methodical actions, the lingering camera angles, and the silence that preceded each act of violence. The unsettling nature of these films was intensified by the filmmakers' commitment to realism. Directors studied criminal archives, forensic records, and courtroom reports to ensure that even the most horrific sequences adhered to the logic of reality. One murder scene, recreated with painstaking accuracy, was based on an unsolved case from the Midwest, where the perpetrator had eluded police for months. The local community, upon seeing the film, reportedly experienced a mixture of fascination and terror, recognizing familiar streets, buildings, and even minor details from their own neighborhoods. The interplay between the known and the fictional created a cognitive dissonance in viewers, compelling them to question the boundary between cinematic spectacle and the actual world. Public reaction was equally telling. Theatergoers often left screenings pale, trembling, and haunted by scenes that lingered long after the film ended. In several instances, audiences reportedly fainted or suffered panic attacks during particularly intense sequences. Critics argued that the films were exploitative, designed to shock rather than entertain, while fans praised the intensity and authenticity that could not be replicated by sanitized horror. The conversation sparked by these works spilled into newspapers, radio programs, and eventually television shows, igniting debates about morality, censorship, and the power of cinema to shape perception. These films also generated urban legends and whispers of curses surrounding production sets. Crew members recounted mysterious accidents during filming, equipment malfunctioning in inexplicable ways, props appearing in places where they had no logical reason to be, and crew members experiencing unsettling physical or psychological symptoms. One assistant director claimed that during the shooting of a particularly graphic scene, the temperature in the room plummeted. Shadows stretched unnaturally, and faint whispers were heard. Although no one else was present, rumors circulated that some sets were built over sites with violent histories, suggesting that the energy of past crimes had been captured, or perhaps even amplified. By the filmmaking process, The controversy often extended to legal and social spheres. Certain films faced lawsuits from parents, advocacy groups, and local authorities, arguing that their depictions of violence could inspire copycat behavior or harm young viewers. Yet these films persisted, their notoriety fueling further curiosity. Box office numbers often soared precisely because the productions were labeled dangerous or unwatchable. The very act of banning or censoring a film inadvertently amplified its reach, lending it an aura of forbiddance, knowledge that audiences could not resist exploring. Sound and cinematography were crucial tools in cultivating the sense of controversy. Directors employed long, lingering takes to force audiences to confront acts of horror without the comfort of quick edits or relief. Every creak of a floorboard, every hiss of wind through broken windows, every muffled scream was magnified, creating a sensory experience that extended beyond the visual to the psychological. By refusing to sanitize horror, these films forced spectators into a space of moral and emotional engagement, compelling them to wrestle with questions of right and wrong, of fear and fascination. Through these controversial works, horror became a mirror not only of crime and violence, but of societal boundaries themselves. By daring to depict what others would not, filmmakers tested the limits of taste, legality, and audience endurance, leaving viewers unsettled, provoked, and forever changed by the intensity of what they had witnessed. The eerie coincidences surrounding cast, crew, and filming locations have become almost as infamous as the films themselves, blurring the lines between fiction and reality in ways that continue to fascinate scholars and fans alike. In the late 1970s, a filmmaker notorious for his unflinching depictions of violence chose to shoot on location in a small, decaying town whose history was marred by unsolved murders, disappearances, and legends of hauntings. The townspeople whispered that the land itself carried a dark resonance, that the memories of the departed lingered like shadows in empty rooms and alleyways. Crew members reported an oppressive sense of being watched, a subtle but persistent presence that seemed to shift whenever cameras were not rolling. Shadows moved where none should exist, and objects shifted without explanation, creating a disquiet that seeped into every frame. The actors, too, were affected in ways that went beyond mere performance. One young actress, portraying a terrified victim, claimed she felt a tangible pressure in the air whenever a particular scene was shot in the oldest wing of a decaying house. The room, she said, seemed alive, watching her, anticipating her reactions. On several nights, she awoke from nightmares that mirrored scenes she had filmed, leaving her trembling in her bed as though the terror had followed her home. Other cast members reported fleeting glimpses of figures that were never there when they turned to look, fleeting sounds in corridors that no one else heard, and an almost palpable heaviness that descended during the most violent sequences. Even the crew experienced inexplicable phenomena. A camera operator remembered reviewing dailies and noticing shadows appearing in frames that had not existed during filming. One assistant director recounted a day when a piece of set decoration fell from a high shelf without any disturbance, narrowly missing an actor, and then inexplicably returned to its original position later that night. Some crew members began to believe that the house or the location itself was a conduit, channeling a residual energy from past tragedies directly into their production. These stories, whispered off the record for decades, contributed to the growing mythology that the films were cursed, that the horrors captured on screen were not entirely fictional, but fed by a living darkness surrounding them. Certain locations became notorious for the strange events they attracted. An abandoned farmhouse, the centerpiece of a particularly gruesome film in the early 1980s, had a history of disappearances spanning decades. During filming, equipment malfunctioned repeatedly in ways technicians could not explain. Sound technicians reported hearing distant, disembodied voices in empty rooms, and the lead actor claimed he sometimes felt cold hands brush against his back despite being alone. By the time shooting concluded, many involved were reluctant to return to the site. Yet the footage captured was hauntingly effective. Its unnerving realism rooted as much in the residual energy of the location as in the actors' performances. Rumors of strange post-production events further fueled the film's sinister reputation. Editors spoke of hearing screams from the reels when spooling footage late at night, and some claimed that playback equipment occasionally functioned without power, projecting images that were not part of the film. Fans and historians later noted unsettling coincidences. Several actors from these productions experienced unexplained illnesses or misfortune, and some crew members left the industry entirely, citing a fear they could not articulate. The films themselves became objects of fascination, not only for their artistic merit, but because audiences sensed the unexplainable energy embedded within them. The combination of haunted locations, obsessive filmmakers, and troubled cast created a chain reaction, where reality and fiction intertwined. Every camera angle, every shadow, every creak of floorboards became a part of a larger narrative, one that extended beyond the script and onto the streets, into the minds of those who watched. These coincidences were not merely anecdotal. They were woven into the legend of the films themselves, giving them a resonance that persists decades later. An aura suggesting that the horrors depicted on screen were never confined to the theater, but seeped into the world beyond, haunting both creators and audiences alike. Decades after their initial release, these 15 American horror classics continue to haunt audiences, their influence reaching far beyond mere entertainment. The power of these films lies not solely in their graphic imagery or shocking narratives, but in the way they engage the human mind, embedding fear into memory and imagination in ways that conventional storytelling cannot achieve. Viewers are drawn into a psychological labyrinth where every shadow, every silence, every flicker of light seems to pulse with unseen menace. The tension is cumulative, a subtle thread woven through decades of cinematic evolution, connecting the earliest silent experiments with the visceral modern thrillers that dominate theaters today. The lasting impact of these films is particularly evident in the continued fascination with the macabre and the unexplained. Scholars and enthusiasts alike note that audiences are not merely consuming horror, they are entering into an unspoken dialogue with it, exploring fears that are as universal as they are personal. One film, which depicted a remote community terrorized by a mysterious intruder, inspired not only subsequent cinematic works, but also a wave of literature, fan theory, and documentary investigation. Viewers found themselves retracing the steps of fictional characters in real-life locations, visiting the abandoned homes and rural landscapes that inspired the film's chilling atmosphere. As if seeking a direct encounter with the darkness it portrayed, part of the enduring power lies in the way these films captured cultural anxieties unique to their times, while maintaining a timeless resonance. From the disquiet of post-war suburbia to the social upheaval of the 1970s, the psychological and societal fears embedded in these works resonate even with contemporary audiences. Themes of isolation, moral ambiguity, familial collapse, and unseen menace continue to echo in the modern imagination, proving that the terror they evoke is not confined to the screen. Viewers sense the authenticity of these fears, recognizing that the horror is rooted not just in fiction, but in the shadowed corners of human experience, history, and memory. The film's continued relevance is reinforced by the myths and legends that surround them. Stories of cursed sets, mysterious accidents, and unexplained phenomena persist in popular culture, feeding both fascination and apprehension. In some cases, locations where scenes were shot have become pilgrimage sites for enthusiasts, seeking a brush with cinematic history or a glimpse of the otherworldly. Crew members and surviving cast recount experiences that continue to suggest the presence of forces beyond comprehension, hinting at an enduring connection between the art of horror and the residual energy of its creation. These narratives enhance the film's impact, creating a halo of unease that extends far beyond the viewing experience. Even technological advances in film have not diminished their power. Restorations and high-definition re-releases bring these classics to new generations, preserving not only the images but the atmospheres painstakingly crafted by shadow, light, and sound. Modern audiences report being unsettled in ways remarkably similar to those who first viewed the films, suggesting that the psychological mechanisms of fear, anticipation, suggestion, and the uncanny remain as potent as ever. The combination of historical context, narrative tension, and technical artistry ensures that the film's impact endures, bridging generations through shared experience and collective unease. Critically, these horror classics also demonstrate the capacity of cinema to explore moral and philosophical questions under the guise of terror. They force audiences to confront mortality, the fragility of societal norms, and the latent darkness within humanity. By embedding these reflections within the framework of suspense and fear, filmmakers created works that operate on multiple levels. They entertain, disturb, educate, and provoke. Viewers leave with more than adrenaline. They carry a sense of reflection, a heightened awareness of the unknown, and a lingering apprehension that refuses to dissipate easily. Ultimately, these films persist in the public consciousness because they do not merely depict horror, they orchestrate it, manipulating perception, memory, and imagination in ways that ensure their presence long after the screen has gone dark. Each viewing is a reminder that fear is timeless, that shadows do not fade, and that some stories, no matter how old, refuse to release their grip on the mind. As the shadows fade from the screen and the echoes of the stories linger in your mind, ask yourself how much of what we see in horror is truly fiction, and how much is a reflection of the darkness that quietly waits in the corners of our own world. These films were never just entertainment, they were mirrors, capturing obsessions, crimes, and fears that refuse to die. Whispers of the past that still reach us through flickering frames. If your heartbeat has not yet returned to its normal rhythm, if your thoughts still trace the haunted streets, abandoned homes, and whispered legends we've explored tonight, then you are part of the story now. The more we question, the deeper we understand the ways fear shapes us, and the more we are drawn to seek the shadows behind history's darkest moments. Subscribe now to follow the trail of America's most chilling mysteries, and join a community unafraid to confront the unsettling truths lurking beneath every frame of our collective past. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us which film, which story, or which shadowed truth unsettled you the most. And remember, the darkness doesn't end here. There are more secrets, more obsessions, and more horrors waiting in the corners of history, waiting to be discovered. Will you dare to look closer?